YouTube. I'm streaming to Facebook. Let's check out YouTube here. If you're tuning in, hello. The purpose, is it going to be under there? I'm going to assume that it's working. I guess is there a way for me to tell my channel? Live now. It says live now. Awesome. Okay. So hello, welcome to this stream. We're talking about the 70-535 exam. And in this video, I'm going to try, so it's 2:49 right now. I'm going to try to cover the 70-535 exam requirements. Okay, so let's switch over to the official landing page here. So there are 6 top level requirements of the 70-535 exam. This is as of March 22nd. It's now the end of July. So these exam requirements have not changed in a little bit. But there are 6 exam requirements. I'm going to try to hit them about 10 minutes each. So we're really going to be flying through this. And so this is sort of, hopefully we'll make a good review if you are looking at taking this exam sometime soon. But basically, let's go through. Now, 70-535 exam is, in some people's views, the most difficult of the exams because it's it covers almost everything. Like there are literally more than 100 topics covered on this exam. Now, as an architecture exam, one of the architect's main jobs and main decisions here is to decide what technology pieces to put together to form the solution. So if you are faced with a business challenge and you need to sort of either develop something new, get something off the shelf, take one of Microsoft's existing services, this, that, and that, you're trying to make these kind of decisions. Understanding all of what Microsoft offers within Azure is sort of key to that, because then you're able to build a solution that's going to be the cheapest, it's going to be the fastest to get to market, it's going to reduce maintenance afterwards, etc., etc. You've got all these sort of requirements for you to create a solution that satisfies the business need. So that's what this exam is basically testing, and that's why it is notoriously one of the more difficult exams. So 70-535, there is a page for this. If you go into Google and you search for 70-535, this link should be the top link, or Bing, I guess, if that's your choice. Exam's $165. It's available. It's available right now only in English. I'm surprised about that, but it is part of many different MCSAs, MCSEs, MCSDs. Like this is sort of an unlocking exam for so many different parts. Okay. Now, before we get too far into this, if you're just tuning in, my name is Scott Duffy, and I teach a number of courses, mostly on Udemy, but also on other platforms, for the Azure certifications and other Azure exams. You'll see that I'm just touching 100,000 students. Thank you very much. I am super, super grateful to every single student. But I have free courses on Azure. I have paid courses. I have exam preparations. So I do have a course on the 70-535 exam that you can sign up for if you really want. This course right now I think is pushing 19 hours. So we're going to try to push this through in 1 hour, but really it's going to be, I apologize, it's going to be a bit of a superficial thing to it. Okay. Anyways, I ask you to subscribe or hit the thumbs up or share this in your social media, etc. Would really appreciate that as we get through this. Now, I should give a caveat. Microsoft has what's called their Ignite conference in the end of September every year. This year, it's September 24th to 28th. This conference is notorious for when they announce the biggest changes to the exams. So here I am recording this in July. We've got August. We've got September. 2 months until Microsoft Ignite. And I should set the stage and say, yeah, there probably will be changes to this exam. That said, if you are in the process of studying, I never believe in trying to time these things and delay 2 months and delay 4 months. we never know. Like the last time they made a change, which was last year, the exam went into effect January. So here we are, in July, expecting the next set of exams to go live in January. That's still half a year away. So if you're studying for this exam, you can keep an eye out for Ignite. I'm going to be there. If you're there, I'd love to shake your hand and say hello. So we'll look for each other. But the exam possibly will have some significant changes in the end of September, probably going live in November, something like that. So that's just the reality. And that's Microsoft changes their exams and changes their technology faster than Amazon, for instance. And so that's what we expect. Okay. So we're 5 minutes into this, and I'm going to hit the first topic. So the first requirement on the exam requirements is called Design Compute Infrastructure. Now, if I go into this, I see that there are 5 subtopics under that, including design solutions using virtual machines, design solutions for serverless computing, design microservices-based solutions, design web apps, and design compute-intensive applications. Now, I'm not obviously going to have time to get into each of these, but let's tackle the virtual machines. So I go into the Azure portal. The URL is portal.azure.com. Now, you should know, I should say, there is an Azure free account, and it's actually a pretty cool offer, okay? So basically, Microsoft's offering a $250 credit. I think this must be the Canadian offer. $250 Canadian credit. Oh, it's $200 US. That's confusing. The ad said $250, but it says $200 credit for 30 days. So you can go into Azure. You can start to fire up services that would normally cost money, and run down that $200 credit within the first 30 days. And then within the first 12 months, you get a bunch of stuff for free. And then there's stuff that's just always free. If we go down here, the 12 months offer, you get a Linux machine, B1S, Windows machine, B1S. You can have basically a full month of compute every month. So that's similar to the AWS free tier. Okay, so going back to here, let's talk about a Windows virtual machine, because that's sort of the basics where everyone starts. Now, virtual machines come in a couple of different flavors. Still today, they're offering the difference between a flash hard disk and a spinning magnetic hard disk for the virtual machine. So you can imagine the virtual machine has a hard disk associated with it. That's going to be the operating system disk. And you do get to choose between SSD and HDD. Now, the difference is a little bit of speed. So the flash disks, of course, are a little bit faster, so you can expect it to boot faster. Anything that you need to save a little bit faster on the SSD than the HDD. But then you can also expect it to be a little bit more expensive, right? So again, that's just reality too. So I'm going to have to remember my password here. Always focus when you're typing in the password field. So put in your user ID and password. Now, they have this concept called resource groups. Within Azure, resource groups are basically an organizational structure. You can organize most of your resources into resource groups. This allows you to determine things like billing. You can delete resources, every resource in a group, so it's very quick for cleanup. You want to put all your resources for a project into a resource group. It makes things a lot easier. You can also handle security at the resource group level, etc. Now, Microsoft has, I think it's currently 51 locations around the world. They call them regions. Not every region is accessible to me. Okay, so I don't see China in here. I don't see any of the government regions because my account is not activated for that. But if you look at the Azure regions, go into global infrastructure regions, we can see actually it changes all the time. So it's 54 regions right now. in 140 countries availability. Go down to the map. We can see that Department of Defense has one, etc. U.S. government is a separate one. Those ones I wouldn't have access to. But you've got Canada, Canada East, Canada Central, all a bunch of U.S. ones. There's one data center in Brazil. They're really building out Europe. A couple of years ago, they only had 2 data centers in Europe, but now they're announcing Switzerland, Germany, Norway, France. These are all relatively new data centers. Used to be just a UK, I believe there was a UK one, and maybe Germany back in the day, but all bunch of Europe West has been blown out. United Arab Emirates, that's going to be the first one within the Middle East. South Africa will be their first data center in Africa. Australia, they announced a couple of years ago. That's been extremely popular. I actually remember stories about Australia being sold out, that they didn't have any more virtual machines. So when we're creating our data center, we can choose from anywhere in the world, essentially, that we're allowed to. If you have an agreement with Microsoft, if you're an enterprise customer and you have a number of Windows licenses, you can reuse your Windows license in Azure, and you basically cut your price in half for a virtual machine. When you look at the list of available virtual machines, remember the free plan offers this B1, I believe it's the B1S plan, is part of the free plan. So if you are taking advantage of that free plan, you're going to be stuck with this B1S level. It is extremely cheap. Look, it's only $17 Canadian a month, about $15 US a month for this machine. But it's also extremely underpowered. To be honest, 1 gigabyte of RAM, 1 virtual CPU, 800 operations per second in terms of writing to the disk, etc. 4 gigabyte drive. So this, you can choose it. It's the cheapest one, but it's also probably the underpowered one. There's B2, B8. These B1s are generally designed for testing and development. You probably would not want to put these B1s into production. It's the D series that is the general purpose series. While we're on the topic, Microsoft does break out their computes into memory optimized, storage optimized, high performance. So you'll find perhaps on the test having to know which series, which letter is into which, and then making decisions that, oh, this is a database, you're going to want to put it in a memory optimized one, or this is a file server, it has to be a storage optimized, etc. Okay, let's check on the time. So basically going through, I'm gonna choose just one here. Again, I can't spend too much time on this. We're probably not going to complete the creation of the virtual machine here. Availability is super important within cloud computing. Basically, Microsoft recently came out with this concept of availability zone. So if you've been Azure user for a little while, but haven't been keeping up, now within certain areas, and I chose Central, so Central is one of those areas, you're able to choose which data center within the Central this machine gets created in. This is an availability play because then you can have one virtual machine in data center 1, one virtual machine in data center 2, and one virtual machine in data center 3, and then you're basically protected against any of the disasters that could befall an individual data center. So distributing your virtual machines across multiple data centers is a new option, not available in many regions. The availability set is still a thing that you should keep in mind because basically Microsoft wants you to distribute your virtual machines across hardware. So you don't want, if you're going to have 2 virtual machines, you don't want them running on the same physical server. You don't want them running even on the same rack because the power supply that feeds the rack could die and then both your virtual machines are gone. Now, Microsoft used to have an SLA for virtual machines that only included virtual machines that were in an availability set. Well, they recently revised that for virtual machines, actually probably the current version of SLA. The latest one gives you 2 or more instances across 2 or more availability zones. So we just talked about availability zones. Then they're giving 99.99, 4 nines. If you're just relying on availability set it's 99.95. Okay. For any single instance, so you're not in availability set, you're not in availability zone, then 99.9. So they've expanded their SLA recently, March 2018, to include single instances. That's a change. So availability is important. We'll get into storage later in this course, networking later in the course, etc. Auto shutdown is really good for testing and development. So I always, when I create something for testing, like it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon right now, I would say the auto shutdown should be 4 o'clock in the afternoon, just because I don't want to pay for this machine. I need it for this moment, but not beyond an hour from now. So, etc. Diagnostics, etc. So, I need at least one inbound port. I'm going to choose HTTP, HTTPS, RDP. You want to be able to connect to this machine from home, right? That's cool. Then basically it's exposed to the internet. So now they give you the summary, and this is where you find out the pricing. This includes the machine, includes the operating system. If you're using other images besides Windows, there might be some software costs in here. And then it summarizes all of the things that you need to know. Now, I'm not going to create this because we don't have time right now, but virtual machines are super easy to create. I think for this exam, I would recommend going in and start playing around, creating virtual machines, killing them, changing them, Red Hat, Linux, Ubuntu. Just play around with some of these virtual machines, and you'll get that. So serverless, Azure Functions is really what Microsoft recommends for serverless. There are some other serverless options within Azure data storage. The concept of serverless is basically you don't have to worry about the operating system, patching of the operating system. You don't have access to the machine. You can't remote desktop into it or SSH into it. It's not quite web app level, but it's basically you just hand a code over and Microsoft will take care of running it. They worry about performance. With web apps, you still do have the concept of a web app environment, right? An app service environment, and that's like a hosting plan, and you can upgrade your app service environment to get more performance. So with web apps, you are basically picking a server, and then you can just install more apps, have more instances, etc. With serverless, really is Microsoft taking over. Microservices is more of a design change, the way that people design applications. Instead of creating one giant application with a million lines of code, you want to break up your code into smaller pieces, into 6, 8, 10, 12 little tiny applications, all communicating to each other, sending messages, queues, databases, however they communicate. Microservices are really tiny applications, and the theory, at least, is that it's easier to create, easier to maintain. You can have different people working on the application, so someone's responsible for the user profile app, and then someone else is responsible for the recipe database, and they do not have to talk to each other, because once you have that contract of an interface and API, then it's like two different teams. Microsoft uses Service Fabric a lot for this. There are some pros and cons. As microservices, we just said a year ago that that was the future, but we're starting to find that it's not perfect for every situation. So you really do want to find out. One of the key skills of this exam is understanding when to use a virtual machine, when to use a web app, when to use a microservice. Now, compute intensive is a couple of different things. There's Azure Batch, which is where you create jobs and tasks, and you may have break something up into 1 million different tasks that can be run concurrently, and Microsoft will just spin up 1,000 virtual machines, get your work done very quickly. This could be genetics. It could be rendering a movie, anything that can be done independently, DNA testing, finding alien life among the stars, anything like that. The other aspect of compute intensive is just really big, powerful servers. So Microsoft has their, I think it's the H series, the high performance intensive series. It's also the high end of the A's. So A8, A10, A12. Those are really powerful machines, 32 CPUs, etc. 128 gigabytes of RAM. So hypercomputer intensive is basically the biggest servers, or breaking it up into Azure Batch tasks and things like that. Okay, so let's call that for the compute infrastructure. Next up, we have data implementation. So the requirements say a design for Azure storage solutions. Now, Azure storage is the blobs. It's the storage account. If we go into here, the first one is called storage account. And basically, actually, I'm just going to go and find, I'm going to discard that. I'm going to find an existing storage account that I have to demonstrate. Here's a storage account. It's a Dev Test Lab account. Now, storage account has a default storage account has blobs, files, tables, queues. It supports many different types of objects. Okay. Now, a blob, binary large object. It's basically a file, but it's a very flat structure. This does not support folders and hierarchies and things like that. You have containers, and then you have blobs in there. Now, you could fake a folder structure by having like slashes in your container name, etc. But under the hood, it's a very flat structure. Files is actually similar to Windows, similar to a folder structure hierarchy, supports SMB, which allows you to mount the mount a file server. So if you have 20 different virtual machines, you can have an Azure file server and then mount the S drive on each of them, and they all have a common folder that they can save their log files or their read the common stuff. Tables is a tabular structure. There's some very complex and sophisticated data and NoSQL and SQL relational databases, but the tables system within storage accounts are very simple. And also queues, right? The first in, first out, or last in, first out, basically being able to put something into a queue and another program comes along and processes it. So within the data implementation, we have storage, which we just talked about. One thing to note is it does say Azure Secure Storage Encryption, but Azure storage accounts are encrypted by default. Okay, you cannot unencrypt a storage account. So if I go into the encryption tab, storage service encryption, it protects your data. And when you create a storage account, it automatically encrypts it on the disk. So within the Microsoft Azure Data Center, any files that I put in the storage account sitting on that disk is encrypted. Microsoft has the keys. Now it's magic, right? The storage, when I write it, I write it unencrypted, and then it gets encrypted by the API and gets stored to disk encrypted. When I want to read it, it reads the encrypted, it automatically decrypts it and sends it to me decrypted. You do have the option of providing your own key for that. If you don't want Microsoft to have the key, you can provide the key. But even though it's on the exam as a requirement, it's not really an option. You can't turn it off. You just can provide your own key. Azure Data Box is relatively new. That's cool. So I think they've always had this problem of people who've got lots of files and they want to get them into Azure. It's like you got 200 terabytes of images, and it's like, how am I going to get them there? And how do you get them there? Do you upload 200 terabytes? How many months or years is that going to take? So Azure Data Box is basically a hard disk. They'll mail it to you, and it has 100 terabyte capacity, so you can pop your data in there to up to 100 terabytes, and then you send it back to them, and then they'll hook that up, and you basically go in and you can copy those files from your Azure Data Box into your account. Okay, so it's basically I mean, 20 years ago, I was mailing hard disks through the mail to get data across the country. It hasn't really changed. Okay, this is a prettier box. They also have smaller data, which is sort of like an SSD, if you will, from 8 terabytes. It's an 8 terabyte drive, and you can get up to 5 of them. So if you don't want this big bulky thing, then they'll send you out smaller disks. Okay. that's cool. Keep an eye on the time here. So now data services is another interesting category. You would think data services, but what they're talking about is the supporting services. Azure Data Catalog is a way for you to document all of your data usage within your enterprise. You can create all your table structures. People can go in there and write comments to say, basically, this table is where the customer is stored. And even though this says first name, it's not mandatory, and we don't have first names for 50% of our customers. So as you're, this knowledge is super important. You don't want someone developing an application that relies on a field, which doesn't really mean what the person who developed the app thought it means. So data catalog is age-old problem. Again, 20 years ago, we were doing this old-fashioned way, but basically it allows you to create a knowledge base, a central repository for your data usage and what things mean and where they live. The data factory is like an orchestration layer that takes data from some outside source. If you need to run it through an ETL, then the data factory is basically a way of loading your data from one spot, getting it into, let's say it's a SQL data warehouse it needs to get to. So I look at the Azure Data Factory. Let's Google that real quick. There's a diagram on the Data Factory page, I think, that sort of demonstrates it really well. So this page, probably, oh, there it is. So you've got the Data Factory as the orchestration layer right across the top. And so it can take your data from the left here, which is from other cloud providers, from on-premises data or some, software as a service, in through the Azure Data Factory application, which is ETL, and then into a blob storage that gets popped into data warehouse. That's all orchestrated by Data Factory. Okay, so it's sort of a combination of things. We're not going to get into data warehouse, data lake analytics. So these data services are basically services that support data, right? It's like what we used to call SSIS, which is SQL Server Integration Services. Now is like Data Factory, right? Or SQL Server Reporting Services, or SQL, which is SQL Server Reporting Service like Power BI, but SQL Server Analytics Service, SSAS, is now Azure Analysis Services, stuff like that. Relational databases, Microsoft's been a leader, or one of the leaders in databases as long as I can remember. Back to SQL Server. They've got this concept called StretchDB, really cool. It's a way of having your database on your local premises and then extending it into the cloud so you can take advantage of cheaper storage, or maybe your database is grown. I worked for a company once where we had 800 gigabyte database, and it was just growing, like it was growing 1 gigabyte per day at that level. And at some point you're like, man, we're going to run out of storage on this server, within the next 6 months. And then you got to start thinking about like archiving, or how you're going to trim it out, or like how you're going to shard this database or whatever. StretchDB is something that you can turn on. You can point it at certain tables, say, you know what, this order history table is the least likely table to be needed on a day-to-day basis. And so you can just get certain tables pushed off to Azure, and SQL Server takes care of that. Okay. How are we doing for time here? And I'm going to keep checking the time because I really want this to be like 60, 70 minutes. And I want to get through it all, right? Now, Azure SQL Database. SQL Database is Microsoft's version of the database in the cloud that can handle 90% of what people need it to do. Okay, so it's scalable, it's stretchable. You have standalone databases. You can have elastic databases, which contain many different databases. It's basically growth on demand. You pay as you grow, and you don't have to have that thought of outgrowing your database. There are really going to be some cases, though, where SQL database is not the right solution. And so part of this exam and part of your the need for you to know this is, when do you not want to use Azure SQL Database? So if I was doing this exam, I would look at the questions, and Azure SQL Database would be sort of top of my mind as being, listen, let's choose Azure SQL Database for every solution unless there's really good reasons not to. Okay, so if it is the case where performance is like let's say you're running some type of application and database performance has been historically your biggest challenge. You really need database performance experts, and these guys are tuning the SQL, the memory settings, and they're in there. They know their Windows registry settings that are required. They know every single tweak of SQL Server in order to get the most performance. Well, transitioning to Azure SQL Database might be a bit of a challenge, right? Because even if you go for the larger ones, you might have latency or IO issues or pricing or something like that. So there are edges of the use case where going to SQL Server in the cloud is the right solution. And then the other things are going to be like SQL Data Warehouse for reporting needs. What is the difference between SQL Server or SQL Database and SQL Data Warehouse, etc. Okay. Microsoft also has managed solutions for MySQL and PostgreSQL. So if you are currently running an app that uses MySQL as its data storage, and you're like, man, I got to convert this to Azure SQL Database in order to move it to the cloud, you don't have to. Microsoft has an equivalent option, which is a managed MySQL solution, very easy to go in. Let's go into here, create. Now, if I type MySQL, there's going to come back with a lot of different results. Okay, so MySQL, you'll see the first one is PHP Bulletin Board. So right off the bat, it's a web app that is a PHP Bulletin Board running on a MySQL database. So that's not what we want. Okay, Microsoft also has web app with MySQL option, which is very similar. You can have your app in MySQL running within a web app. What we want is Azure Database for MySQL. So again, it's a MySQL as a service. Go in here, I can fill out the forms, and within 5 minutes, I'm going to have a MySQL database that is a database as a service, just like Azure SQL databases. Okay. So NoSQL options now. The relational database options tend to be legacy applications. These are things that you started small, you're running on SQL Server, or you're running on MySQL, and then you want to get into the cloud. These days, a lot of people create NoSQL type options. So you're going to want, now we're going to talk about Cosmos DB as being the most popular as a separate category. But storing your data in NoSQL options is often quicker. There's no relations between the tables. So basically, you're just storing an object and you want to go get that object. You request that object back by its name, etc. Okay. Now, Cosmos DB, this to me, other than Azure SQL Database as being the default solution for relational databases, Cosmos DB is the default solution for non-relational databases. MongoDB, there's a Graph API option. There's column storage, which is tables. So you should go into a situation where you need, where speed is an issue, where there's no relationships, brand new development, there's no existing legacy code to handle around. Thinking about if you can store stuff in Cosmos DB. Cosmos DB is designed as, I mean, the name gives it away, right? It's universe level storage, right? It's globally distributed. It's a multi-model, which means that it supports Graph API, document model, which used to be called Document DB, the column model, and just key value pairs. So there's many different data types that it can store, and it's elastic. It sort of distributes your data around the world. Great for mobile apps, great for software as a service. When you've got distributed applications, this Cosmos DB is sort of, I think I said, it's what Microsoft wants you to choose unless you have really good reasons to run other data solutions. Okay. All right, let's move on. So that was data implementation. Now we're talking about networking implementation. So we talked about compute. We've talked about data. Networking is sort of the third leg of the stool for designing great solutions. Now, when it comes to networking, Microsoft is really good at allowing you to create virtual networks within Microsoft Azure. The concept of a virtual network is just like a router or a network that you would have on premises. You know, you got multiple computers plugged in. It can dynamically distribute IP addresses, and all of the machines on the same network can communicate to each other. And then if you were to create another physical network and connect them over a wide area network, then you've got firewalls, and so you'd have to open ports in order to get two computers on different networks to talk to each other. Same exact concept, right? So when you create a virtual network, by default, you're creating, actually there's a virtual network, and then there's this concept of the subnet. Okay, so this is, you create a virtual network. I'm going to call it AZSG test VNet. Now, the first thing you're going to encounter is this address space. Now, you can choose any address you want by default. These are private addresses. I can choose 1.1.1.1 if I wanted to. But we know there's internet protocols, and there are certain addresses that are specifically reserved for private use. The 10 dot range is one of those. There's many of them. 192, and what's the other one? 170, 172. There's a few other addresses that are reserved specifically for personal use. But you'll see by default, I'm given this 10 dot address. Now this uses what's called CIDR notation, or CIDR, right? CIDR cheat sheet would be a good one. Now, basically CIDR notation, and I'm going to zoom in on this, you specify the address range with this slash. So /24 notation represents 254 usable IP addresses, starting with 0 and ending with, 255 or whatever. So let's go back to here. If I was to say I want 24, you'll see that it's allowing me 10.1.0.0 to 10.1.0.255. Okay. The lower the number, the more addresses. So if I was to say 23, I would expect 512. It basically doubles. It's a factor of 2. 22 would be 1024. Now, Microsoft does reserve, I believe it's 5 addresses out of this range for its own uses. Okay, so whatever I've reserved here, 1024, 5 of them are not available to me. It's actually 1019. Again, as usual, put it in a resource group. I'm going to put it into, I didn't end up creating that resource group, did I? So AZSJD test resource group. Keep it in central. Now, the concept of the subnet. So I've just reserved 1,000 IP addresses on this network. Now, I probably should break that up into multiple subnets. And I can call it whatever I want, but I'm going to say call this front end. So it's default by default. So I've reserved 1,000 addresses, but I'm only going to use a quarter of them on the first subnet. Okay, I'll skip over this DDoS protection, which costs a little bit of money, but it does some active analysis of traffic coming to your network, and will determine if people are trying to break in or whatever. So basically, higher than normal amount of preventative security, threat detection. Okay, so I'm going to say create. Go ahead, why not? So this is usually pretty quick because this is all done by software. There's nobody running within Microsoft Azure right now plugging in all your networks for you. So the subnet concept would be you can create your front end, you can create your app tier, you can create your back end, you can create something for the developers, a jump box or whatever, external VPN. All that stuff can be created on one network, but with subnets. Okay. Let's go back down into networking implementation. So virtual networks are pretty straightforward. it also includes load balancing, which, so if you've got multiple VNs, you want to distribute traffic across those, you're going to use either a public load balancer or an internal load balancer. Traffic Manager is really cool in that it works with the global DNS system. You can set this up so that your user can get sent to the server that is closest to them or fastest to respond. So you can actually have your application running in 5 different data centers around the world if you wanted to, and then put Azure Traffic Manager in front of that. And depending on where that user is, if they're in Japan, they're in the United States, they're in Europe, they're in Asia, they're in Africa, they're going to be sent to the servers that are quickest for them. So this is really a global load balancer. Now, the key to that this works only, I would say that this load balancer happens at the DNS resolution stage. And so a server that might be quickest right now might not be the quickest 2 minutes from now, but at that point, that user is connected to that data center and they're not going to be redirected in the middle of their session. Okay. Now, if you put a 30-minute TTL on your domain, they might check again 30 minutes later. All right. Now, of endpoints. This concept of service endpoints is relatively new too. It's an additional layer of security. So if you are basically creating a storage account, okay, the storage account by default is globally accessible, but you can create service endpoints on that storage account so that it only connects to a certain virtual network. Let's see if my virtual network got created while we were talking here. So you can create, that's it, I believe. You can create service endpoints so that this virtual network, AZ, SJD, Test, VNet, is the only network that can connect to those storage accounts. And there's many different services across Azure. They keep growing them. So every time I check, the list changes. But Azure Storage, your SQL database can also be tied to a virtual network, Cosmos DB, SQL Data Warehouse, all of these services so far. And again, they keep adding to this. The reason, basically, this is an additional layer of security. So you can't, if you had an Azure Storage account that did not have Azure Service Endpoints set up, they still need the keys in order to get access to the account. The hackers would still physically need that complex series of numbers and letters in order to get in. But the service endpoints basically cuts off public internet access to these things. And so even if they had the keys, they would not physically be able to access your storage account, or they would not physically be able to access your SQL database because it's not physically, but it's tied to that specific virtual network. They would need to then hack into your virtual network in order to hack into these things. And so it's an additional layer of security. So that's if security is important, you probably want to set up service endpoints unless you really have a good reason not to. I would say it like that. Okay. So when you're designing a solution in real life, or when it comes to the test, if the service endpoints are options or generally available, then you would want to enable service endpoints so that only virtual machines that you've designated on that virtual network get access to that data. And that's the maximum amount of security, at least, it's additional layer of security. VPNs. Now, VPNs have always been tricky. So we've got point-to-site VPNs, which is a VPN software that I install on my computer. See, I probably still have it, right? Where is that here? So I've got an AZ534 new virtual network. There's a VPN client on this machine that I can connect into Azure. That's called point-to-site. Site-to-site VPNs, it's basically your entire data center is connected into Azure, and only those machines can connect. Site-to-site VPNs require a gateway. Within Azure, Gateway is a software that you can install, or there are also Gateway marketplace images. Let's go into home here. So Gateway. So there are Gateway images, as well as Microsoft having a virtual network gateway that's a Microsoft product. But then you need a physical gateway on your network in order to talk to this. Okay, so it's basically an encrypted traffic over the open internet, but it's encrypted between that device and this virtual network gateway. Okay, and then the third option is called express route. Express route or express route. This is a private fiber optic network, and so it's not the open internet. If you are a bank or got some high value data, you may want to consider ponying up for an express route connection. It's the quickest connection. It's also doesn't travel over the internet. You're dealing with both Microsoft and your local, not even ISP, there's another name for it, but your internet provider. You have to work with them in order to get this private connection between your data center, the internet provider, and the internet provider has a private connection, fiber optic, with Microsoft. Okay. Global VNet peering is the ability to connect two virtual networks. Remember, we were saying you've got a device here and a device there, and you have to open up a port. But within Azure, you can do this through VNet peering, and devices on those networks can talk to each other. Hybrid. Now, a couple years ago, I thought hybrid, the exam was basically very hybrid focused, and it's sort of one of the most common things where you still have your own data center, you still have your apps, you still want your single sign-on, you still want this, you still want that, but you also want to take advantage of Azure. So I think this is starting to taper off a little bit. People are starting to develop cloud-native applications. They're starting to get less dependent on their data centers, but hybrid is still on here. So Azure Relay Service, this is a cool thing that basically allows you to have a connection from outside the the internet into your corporate network without having to open up the firewall. So we know that sometimes going to our IT department and saying, listen, I have this app and I need to get access to this service, but the service is running behind the firewall. How do we do this? Azure Relay Service basically puts a relay within Azure, and that relay has a connection open into your data center that's done through an outbound. You have to have some software installed within your company, but that's basically from your company to Azure, and then it opens up a channel, and then you can use Azure Relay Service to communicate to that Windows Communication Framework API within your data center without having to go through the firewall process, etc. All right. Okay, so to keep on schedule, we're going to flip ahead to security. Now, it's 2018. Security is just all over the news, okay? Companies are getting hacked. Equifax, Home Depot, American Express, you name it, that company has lost some data. Yahoo, right? So security is sort of like has to be baked into every solution. You have to know when you are designing the solution how you're going to how things are going to be encrypted, how data is going to travel the right way, how you're going to authenticate people, how you're going to be able to grant granular levels of access from administrators down to authorized super users down to just regular contributors, etc. So Microsoft's default identity solution is Microsoft Azure Active Directory. If you're looking at a question on the test or you are looking for a solution in real life, Microsoft wants you to think of Azure Active Directory as the identity as a service solution. Okay? Now, what this means, and here's Azure Active Directory. What this means, and I have Azure Active Directory, so let's switch over to it. Go home. So what this means is that you're going to have users, you're going to have groups. Okay, this is my Azure directory. It cost me nothing, so you can create it. There is a little bit of a process to setting it up. I had to create a separate network. So there's my Azure account and then my Azure Active Directory account, etc. Again, it's free. You got the concept of users, you got the concept of groups, and you got the concepts of applications. Now, you basically want to register your applications with Azure Active Directory. Those applications give authority to certain groups, and then you're basically giving users roles within those groups. So it's sort of a user group app type thing, and instead of granting users applications, you grant them roles, etc. So Azure Active Directory is basically the solution that Microsoft wants you to think of when you are thinking of authentication in the cloud. Now, Microsoft kind of dominates authentication within the enterprise with their Windows Active Directory product. There is some similarity between Windows Active Directory and Azure Active Directory, but they are not the same thing. And Azure Active Directory does not replace Windows Active Directory. Okay, so don't think of it as, oh, we can get rid of our Windows Active Directory once we get Azure Active Directory. So so let's say you want to include a single sign-on type process where users who are already signed into their Windows machine in your company can go to an Azure app, and it automatically recognizes who they are and gives them appropriate permissions. They do not need to have a user ID and password to your application running in the cloud because it's called single sign-on. This is done using Azure Active Directory. You need to connect your Windows Active Directory into Azure Active Directory. So there is a connectivity solution. Let's see, it's Azure. See if my computer, oh great. Every once in a while, I probably haven't installed Windows in ages. Probably should do that. But basically, AD Connect is AD Connect, Azure Active Directory Connect, synchronizes your Windows Active Directory with Azure Active Directory. Okay, the idea is that you don't need to copy, import, export, get all your employees out of Windows Active Directory into Azure. You set up this AD Connect sync, and then whenever you've made a change to a user, added one, removed permissions, disabled, there's a delay, but there's a synchronization between Azure AD and Windows AD. Okay. So this Azure AD Domain Services is relatively new. Okay, so when I was getting into Azure AD, it wasn't really a thing. But basically, it is a domain controller as a service. Okay, so if you are creating your Windows machines in the cloud and you need to connect them to a domain controller, you don't have to use your company's domain controller. You can create a domain controller, have them connected. Domain controllers are great for failover scenarios. So for instance, if you have a multi-cluster Windows application in the cloud, and then one of them dies and we need to transfer traffic to another, you need to have a domain controller basically. So an Azure AD Domain Services would fulfill that. All right. The other sort of concepts that you'll need to understand is, we'll get into MFA. B2C and B2B are important concepts. So AD B2C is the way that Microsoft allows you to use third-party identity providers. So you know how there are companies that will let you use Facebook to log into their application, but they're not Facebook, but they have used Facebook Connect. Google also has identity provider, and Microsoft. So basically, Azure AD B2C is the way of using Facebook, Google, Yahoo, Microsoft to let people log into those accounts, and you recognize them as users on your application. Azure AD B2B is how you work with external partners. So let's say you're a company like McDonald's and you have a number of companies that are really close partners, and you want to collaborate. You have applications that are shared. You have a custom developed application and you want your external vendor to be able to have access to that, so you work together on projects. you might set up something like ADB2B between your Active Directory and their Active Directory, which will allow them to have single sign-on through their company, which is not managed by you, but you still recognize them. So basically, it's a form of what's called federation. You're federating, or you're trusting that company's Active Directory instance to do the authentication, and then assigning the role based on your settings, basically, for B2B. Data security, we already talked about storage accounts, but there are other types of encryption as well. So when you're creating Azure disks to attach to your VMs, you can enable Azure disk encryption, or actually it's enabled by default. You can disable it. You might want your backups to be enabled, Azure Key Vault to store your security secrets. So it's not just your keys, but it could also just be your secret code, your API code for accessing some external service stored in the vault. The application has to authenticate with the vault, and that gives them the key in a very secure manner without having to reveal your keys to your developers or even to your ops people, etc. We're coming to the end of the 10 minutes here. I noticed that they're adding things around governance and policies as well. I mean, that's architecture. So how do you have a policy around role-based security? How do you define roles? Is it just admin and user, or are there granularities to roles? You need a strategy for that. Privileged identity, managed service identity. So managed service identity is when you have applications that need access to things, but you don't want to have to create a user that application logs in as that user, right? Basically, it's an identity you create for applications, but you're not hard coding user ID and passwords into them, etc. Okay. And security, I mean, this is more for ops people, but having like Azure Security Center, Operations Management Suite Security, these are applications that you install in your data center that can manage your entire set of servers. You can have your servers, your virtual machines, your cloud virtual machines, all managed in this. You can just sort of manage a dashboards of all your servers. You can dig down, you can check the patches, whether they've had the latest security patch installed. It's basically a remote control for your entire thing. Security and audit is still big within IT space, making sure that you are up to date. I mean, they said that it was Equifax was hacked based on not having the latest patches, a year-old patches for Java struts or something like that, right? Okay, platform services. Now, Microsoft, beyond the stuff that you code yourself, so the web services, web apps, compute, and serverless and microservices, Microsoft provides cognitive services, bots, Internet of Things, hubs. These are services that Microsoft provides that you can just turn on and maybe very quickly connect your things together. So cognitive services is cool. So let's go back to here and let's look at the bot services. So hopefully you've heard of what a bot is, but basically this is the case of a chat bot where a user can enter something into could be Messenger, could be a widget on your website, and the intelligence here tries to understand what they're saying and then come up with the best answer to give to them. So you can say, what are your hours of operation, and what is your how to get to your location, and what's your holiday specials, what coupons do you have? These types of questions can be handled by a machine. Okay, and Microsoft has their bot service for you to develop this. There's lots of other, actually, if I look into cognitive services, there's so many. Actually, it might be better to look at their website, Azure Cognitive Services. There's so many great cognitive services. It's kind of blows my mind that we're in this age. So let's look at the vision type services. basically, you can pass an image to the vision service, and it will come back with tags to say what it spots: woman, person, child, car, tree. Like it basically recognizes the contents of an image. Also, now they, it's kind of controversial to have it as recognizing people because of privacy, but they don't mind making it celebrity recognition. So if you upload a picture of an actor, it'll come back with a name for that actor, stuff like that. Optical character recognition. I can remember, 25 years ago, trying to find software that would take an image with text on it and then turn that into text. Now it's just a service in Azure. Handwriting recognition. So you can develop an app that allows people to use their stylus or whatever to enter something, pass that to an API that Microsoft provides, and Microsoft will turn their handwriting into text. Okay. Now they've also got these cool demo buttons sometimes. So you pass it an image with handwriting in it, and you can see here that it's turned sorry, have a nice day, oops, bye, see you soon. It sort of recognizes the words on this page. Right. So if you ever need that, I mean, I can imagine applications might need that, right? Remember the Word Lens was a cool app where you can take your phone, point it at a menu in a different language, and it would translate that. I mean, I can imagine you can turn that. Let's start to close some of these, I guess. So these types of applications are now within our reach as developers because Cognitive Services supports. Where's Cognitive Services? Did I close it? Oh, it's right here. So Cognitive Services supports this. Now you could take that, basically, optical character recognition, turn it into text, and then go down and they have there's a language one. So language translation, right? Automatic language detection, automatic text translation. So Microsoft has vision, speech, language, knowledge. You don't have to know how to implement this for this exam, I should point out. Okay. So the Cognitive Services, just understanding that they have it. Maybe you want to go through each of these and get an idea, go through the demos, get an idea of what it supports, and that'll sort of stir the juices in terms of what cool things you can do with it. Internet of Things. Now, we all have these devices, these Fitbits or things that are built into our cars and stuff like that are always phoning home. Okay. So my hub, my Nest, things like that. So being able to take a stream of data that just keeps coming, never ends, and run certain analytics on it. Let's say you've got a you got a factory, and each machine within your factory has an IoT type device that reports its status back into this central application. You would then could use a stream analytics to analyze the data coming back from the factory in real time. And then when the error rate, let's say that some of these machines will start reporting something anomalous. If the error rate exceeds 5%, it fires off an application, or it fires off a message or an alert. So having something that can just sit on a stream and keep a running total of all the events that happened in the last 5 minutes and know that that's above a certain number, and then fire off something to happen. That's stream analytics. Event hubs allow you to connect anything and anything. So Azure Event Hubs, there's a cool picture on that page. But basically, if you can imagine this thing over here connecting to this thing over here, maybe it's under the documentation section. So anything that can produce an event can then Event Hub features. There used to be this cool picture that would show it connecting anything and anything. Right? So basically, events happen, something listens to the event, and then any number of things can happen. It can create a file, it can fire off a job, it can call a webhook. All of the ways that the events can happen. So think of anything to connecting to anything. Notification hubs, that's more for apps. If you've got a mobile app, you can fire off messages to your mobile app, certain users based on their device, based on the qualities about them, etc. Oh no, actually it's the event grid I was thinking about actually. No, that's embarrassing. Event grid is the anything to anything connection. There it is. So you've got anything that can happen, a new blob or a change to a blob, or a file got media services finished processing, a conversion, any kind of change to your subscription. So if you create a new virtual machine, if you fire up a new resource group, etc., those things create events, and things can happen based on those events. So basically, event grid is the anything to anything connectivity. Now, messaging, it's, I think, one of the smarter strategies. I can remember 25 years ago working with OS2, IBM OS2, and Oracle and C++, creating applications. And I used a message, basically a messaging metaphor. I had multiple applications, and they would write messages into Oracle database, and that application would be checking that Oracle table every few minutes for work to do. A messaging infrastructure is super smart when you're developing applications for the cloud. Okay, do not rely on the fact that you're going to call an API and that API will always be there for you. Downtime happens, SLAs are still only 99.9%, etc. But using messaging is sort of a more reliable way, especially when things don't need to be real time. And so we looked at the Azure storage account early on. They have a queue metaphor within there. We've got our service bus event hubs for passing in messages. The serverless stuff is all triggered based on stuff. So Azure Functions and Azure Logic Apps, something happens and that fires off a program, etc. So understanding when to use a messaging strategy is probably pretty smart. Using queues, there are premium queues and standard queues, and what you get when you get a premium queue. So for instance, I think the Azure Premium Queue, is this going to do this again? The Azure Premium Queue allows you to know that a message is sent once and only once, received once and only once, etc. There are Azure Premium Queue. I have to type the whole thing. So when you think of something like Service Bus for messaging, standard basically doesn't promise you any specific speed. It's variable throughput. It doesn't promise you any specific latency. Pay-as-you-go, etc. Messages of a certain size. If you were to get the premium Service Bus, then you're promised a certain speed. The performance is predictable. You pay by the month, etc. Other things are things such as being able to once and only once promises, whereas in standard messaging, there are certain scenarios where two apps pick up the message simultaneously. So you have to sort of protect against a message being processed twice, etc. Okay, things like that. Media services. Now, this has been added, removed, added to the exam over the years. Really, this is just when you're doing streaming like this, or when you are processing videos. You basically go through media services. It can transcode your media into different formats, and so maybe you're uploading it at 1080p, but you need to be downsized to 480p, etc., etc. All the different options. So all the media services, it's just understanding what it is. I don't think you have to really get in too deep into it. When I took this exam, it wasn't a big part of it. So, okay, we're we're right on time, I guess. Operations is the last requirement of this exam, and this has to do with monitoring and automation. So application monitoring and platform monitoring. Okay. Now, when you are developing an application, you have, as a developer, the ability to send off things for like logging. You want to raise an alert. So Microsoft does provide options for monitoring. Okay. Application Insights is the tool for that. So I'm going to cancel out of this. We won't be creating a bot. But we do want to either turn on Application Insights or set up Application Insights. My dog wants to say hello. So Application Insights is basically a product that Microsoft has within Azure, that if you code your application to work with Application Insights, it's like a dashboard where you can monitor the performance of your apps in real time. Your apps are sending messages or events are happening, etc., stuff like that. So AZ App Insights. Page you go. Create a new group for it. Start create. So if you are looking at this test and questions are coming up relating to applications and being able to monitor performance of applications, you should be looking for Application Insights as a option. Okay, so you can create a dashboard for your application. You can even put this, I think, as a tile on your portal dashboard even. But we can see, you know, applications that are tied into this Application Insights. We can look at their performance over particular periods. We can look at live metrics. We can look at metrics over time, etc. It monitors availability, any kind of failures, performance, etc. Okay, so Application Insights is sort of the dashboard for your apps within Azure. Now, monitoring Azure as a whole is platform monitoring, which is different. Microsoft has some couple of cool products that are relatively new. Azure Health is relatively new. I'll go into here to say Azure Health. Yes. So Azure Health is a product that you can, let's see here, Azure, did I get that right? Azure Health, Azure Advisor Activity Log. I mean, we can see that they've got monitors for Active Directory, AD Connect Health, or Log Analytics Health, etc. I don't see a product for Azure Health. I know Azure Advisor is a product because that's what's going to basically look at your usage of Azure and make suggestions. Well, that doesn't show up either. What's going on here? Azure Advisor. So Advisor is listed under services. So Azure Advisor basically is sort of that platform level. It's an artificial intelligence type product. It looks at your usage of Azure. It looks at your security setup. It looks at performance, high availability, and how you're spending. Now on this particular account, I've spent 19 cents so far, so I'm sure there's no way to reduce that. But it is telling me that I have high impact security recommendations. So I don't have the resources on here, but understanding that using Azure Advisor is a good strategy for making sure that your usage of Azure is optimal. Okay, let's go into the security tab. Follow Security Center recommendations. Let's see what it so apply disk encryption. So I have a virtual machine where disk encryption is not turned on. Endpoint protection is not turned on. So basically external applications can connect to this virtual machine. There's also, I don't have my subscription. Wow. It's contact details. I don't have contact details on my subscription, etc. So these are very valid recommendations. And if I was running a big shop and I had lots of virtual machines, then these recommendations might be, very extremely important to me. Okay. So I would say Azure Advisor is definitely a part of a good security strategy. This Azure Health thing, let's see if what Google has to say. Azure Health. Service Health notifies you. Is that a thing? Oh, there's a... Maybe it's... I don't know. Thanks, Microsoft. So it's basically a personalized dashboard. Get started. That's not helpful. So Azure Service Health is composed of Azure Status, Service Health, and Resource Health. Oh, Service Health is on the home page. Let's check that out. I don't see it. To launch your Service Health dashboard, search for Service Health and more services. All right, so if I go down to, so there's Advisor right off the thing. All services, Service Health. Well, that's weird. Like you enter it in the top or you enter it on the left, it doesn't come up. Suddenly you find it. Okay. So no service issues found. So this is platform level, right? You can create an alert here. I can pin this. Yeah, why don't I pin it to my dashboard? Query name, Service Health. I don't know. Oh, it's not, anyways, so basically Service Health is either on your dashboard or you can find it. Again, go through, this is kind of badly written, Service Health, Azure Advisor, and you'll get a better sense of the platform level issues. Network Watcher is interesting because this is when you're debugging networking problems. So if you've got an Azure virtual machine and you're having problems and it's like, why can't I connect to my VPN, right? I'm remote desktop isn't working. Then you can attach a Network Watcher to a region, and you can only have one on any particular region. And then Network Watcher will basically enable more logging and diagnosis to that particular region for your account. So it's basically a way of turning on, I've got problems and I want to sacrifice a little performance in order to diagnose this. So look into Network Watcher as a way of, either monitoring problems or figuring out what went wrong. I think we're coming up to the end here. Automation. Automation is much bigger on the 533 exam or the new AZ 101, 102 type ones. But Microsoft recommends, so automation is itself a service. So if we go back to the portal, automation is basically a scheduling service. And if you want to have a particular job or a particular thing that happens at a particular time, then you can create an automation account and have things set up for that. But Microsoft does work with these open source solutions like Chef and Puppet. And there's another one, but it's not here. Another one, what's the other one? I'm going to look at the 7533 page for a second. Forgive me, but there's a third one that's Terraform, right? Is it Terraform? Yeah, I think it's Terraform. So Chef, Puppet, and Terraform are sort of the three automation options within Azure. Okay. So if you want to, there's a concept called desired state configuration, DSC, and the idea is that you set up a defined state for your app. So you have a network, you have virtual machines, you have storage accounts. These are the settings for that. You basically define in a file all of the settings for this particular thing, and then you can use something like Azure Automation to check every hour, every 6 hours, that your application is still running in the desired state. What happens over time if you don't have something like this? A developer or an IT person will go into your account and will say, man, I'm having trouble connecting. Let me open up security settings for this just to see if I can connect. And then they connect and it works. And then they forget to turn back the settings to the way that they used to be. Or they're debugging something and they turn on a debugging option, they turn on a flag, your application state has a thing called drift. And over time, if you don't check it, something goes out of sync. Okay. You update the version numbers of 4 of your servers, but the 5th server stays on the old version. You don't get the patch applied. And how are you ever going to detect that stuff? So using scripts and templates is one way of making sure that your application is in a defined state. If a disaster happens, let's say a whole region goes down, you can use your Azure Automation scripts to replicate your application in a whole different region. Okay, so Chef and Puppet are basically open source apps that do this, and Microsoft supports them, and Terraform. PowerShell, you can write scripts to do this work as well, or command line interface, things like that. So using automation is basically a little bit of work invested, but it makes maintenance a lot easier, and it protects against things like drift. So that's the that you stuck with me for an hour. That's awesome. Thank you very much. That is the 6 requirements of the 535 exam as of March 22nd, and I'm recording this at the end of July. Hopefully that made the exam a little bit less intimidating. You still do have to go through. We skipped over tons of stuff because we only have this hour to go through it. But hopefully this was helpful to you. And anyways, my name's Scott. I am going to ask you to hit subscribe, hit like, follow, all this stuff. I do appreciate it. More videos like this, I would looking forward to helping with you. Like I said, I do have courses. I should do a little pimping at the moment. If you go to Udemy, look for me, Scott Duffy, or if you search for Azure, you'll find my courses. I have a 535 exam, which is on architecting Microsoft Azure solutions. I've got over 20,000 students at the moment, I guess. Must be more than that, I think. So this is about to pass 35,000 students. Thank you so much, everybody who's joined this course. If you want a discount to this, there'll be a link. When I do post this eventually, there'll be a link in the description. But you can also go to my blog, and you'll see software architect courses right along the top. And you'll see discount links. Latest discount links are on my website. So go to softwarearchitect.ca, click on this, and you will get a, look at that, 92% off by using my coupon code. And I do appreciate that. That does help me a little bit. So if you found this video helpful, thumbs up, subscribe. And if you want to check out the course, I would love to have you. So my name's Scott. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you again.